got a tiny piece of ground and I call it my own. Call it my own. Call it my own. I got a tiny piece of ground and I call it my own. It's a home for a big old redwood tree. You know the loggers may not like it, but I call it my own. Call it my own. Call it my own. You know the...
Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us again for another edition of the EcoReview. We're a live, hour-long journal focused on environmental issues of importance to just everybody I can think of. Tonight we have one of those really stellar opportunities. We have a great panel of guests, and we're trying something totally unique. And I want to let you know ahead of time, I mentioned live, so get out your pen and write down this phone number, 831-425-8844. You'll see that periodically appear on the screen tonight, but if you have a question or a thought for our guests, we welcome you calling in and joining our conversation. What a unique day. We all know what Thanksgiving means here at EcoReview, and yes, we're going to be giving out this dandy little fellow tonight. Our Turkey Award is going out this evening, but that'll be at the end of the program, so you'll have to stay tuned to figure out who the real winner is of this evening's salutation. But I tell you, as we progress through the night, there'll be no question in your mind where we're intending to place this fellow for his home in the holidays here. I want to introduce in the panel, live in the studio with me tonight, and no stranger to our audience, fortunately, Dan Hafley.
Hey, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's just a pleasure. Dan is Executive Director for O'Neill Sea Odyssey, and all of us see the beautiful school bus, the school boat that O'Neill has out in the harbor. And
first the bus, then the boat. Not in reverse order. Then they reverse when they go home.
This is just a great way for school kids all across California, the Bay Area of California, to be learning about the oceans, unique opportunities and concerns about the oceans. And we're going to be looking at that seriously this evening. And before I get my next guest on the line and our guest by Skype, I'm going to play a little introductory clip because I think that Arnie and Maggie Gundersen are heroes in our time, and I'm hoping that recognition carries out across the globe because they're telling stories that need to be told about what's really happening in our environment of serious import in relation to the results of the tsunami in Japan, the results of the meltdown in Fukushima. And I'm going to be bringing on Arnie in just a moment, but I'd like you to see this first clip. Came out in April this year. It wasn't the very first one that Fairwinds Associates put out, but it's one of the key components to information that we just don't get access to. Arnie is an expert witness. He's a nuclear engineer, and this is not just fictional data or someone's interpretation of what might be going on. These are factual accounts that Arnie has uncovered for us, and we're going to share one. This is the first one I want you to join us for.
Arnie Gundersen from Fairwinds Associates. It's Sunday, April 10th, and for a change of routine, I wanted to do a science experiment today. Back in 1978, I was the lead nuclear engineer on a project in upstate New York, and the company I worked for at that time bought the last nuclear reactor that was ever bought during the first nuclear renaissance. The project was later canceled, but as part of that, one of the things that the vendor gave me, who we bought the reactor from, was a piece of a nuclear fuel rod. This is a nuclear fuel rod. This is zircaloy, and it's the element that's inside of the Fukushima reactors. Now these are about 12 feet tall, and there's thousands of them inside the Fukushima reactor. This is a simulated pellet of uranium. Now it's not the real thing, it's plastic. If it were the real thing, it had been operating in Fukushima, I'd be dead by now. But these pellets go into these fuel rods, and over 4 years create a lot of heat. When the reactor shuts down, they remain hot. So what I wanted to do today is to show you what happens to zircaloy when it gets hot, as it happened when the water stopped in the Fukushima reactors. Okay, we've got our experiment set up here, and this is what we plan to achieve. Here's that fuel. I took the plastic out, and we're going to heat it with a torch to simulate the heat that's coming out of the inside. Then we're going to spray water on the outside, and you'll see steam coming off, which represents the steam that's coming out of Fukushima right now. Now, in that steam is also hydrogen gas, because the water hits the zircaloy and creates not just steam, but hydrogen gas. This is my friend Jim. He's a great neighbor, and he's going to be the acetylene torch person. Okay, the zircaloy is cherry red, and now I'm going to spray it with water as if it were getting some water in the bottom of the reactor. For the next piece of what we just did was we oxidized the zirconium. You can see it's a different color now. The metal that was quite strong becomes very, very brittle. And we were just able to break pieces right off the end of it. Well, inside the nuclear reactor, it ran at that temperature for 7 to 12 hours. The fuel got brittle, and all those nuclear pellets then were allowed to fall out. We just created what went on inside the Fukushima reactor. Those rods glowed that hot for 12 hours or more. Now what happens is we've created an oxide. This is zirc oxide now, and it's very, very brittle. I think you could see these sharp edges. So the fuel that was inside is now free to fall out and onto the bed of the nuclear reactor and begin to melt through, as is happening right now in Unit 2 at least, and perhaps Unit 3 as well. Well, thank you for watching. Arnie Gundersen, Fairwinds, and we'll do another video in a couple days. Thank you very much.
Awesome stuff.
That was incredible, Arnie. I mean, this was an incredible tragedy. 13,000 people lost their lives in this March 11th tsunami. And one of the questions and one of the things I've written about has been a debris field that is now heading across the Pacific Ocean as a result of this tsunami. What do you think the impact of the Fukushima radiation would have on this debris field as it moves across the Pacific?
My position on the debris field is changing, and it's actually getting somewhat worse. I had thought that most of the debris would have not come from the immediate area of Fukushima, and therefore, when the tsunami hit, it was a good 5 to 20 hours between when the tsunami took all this debris out to sea and when the contamination started to come out in large quantities. So my original thought was that the debris field wouldn't be too contaminated. But just this week, TEPCO announced that they had picked up very shortly after the accident relatively high levels of cesium 2,000 kilometers, about 1,400 miles offshore. So I think that debris field is going to be carrying cesium across the ocean. It might be washed off in the meantime, and that's that's going to be something we'll have to find in the future. I'm really worried more, though, about the fish, especially the ones at the top of the food chain, the tuna and the salmon and things like that. Over the next couple of years, this cesium will get picked up and bioaccumulate right up the food chain.
You know, it's interesting, Arnie. We had Dr. Jay Nichols on recently, who's a UCSC marine biologist, and we were talking about that floating field, because there was, in all of these articles, the news that we get appears in one place, one time, and then it's gone. And if you happen to miss that news story when it was registered somewhere, you just don't see it again. But I saw this piece about 3 weeks ago that was talking about 20 million tons of radioactive debris that was floating in a block toward Hawaii and then headed for the western shores. And, you know, I did some rough calculation with it and was talking with Jay about it a little bit, and we said 20 million tons is essentially enough debris to put a foot-deep layer across Rhode Island, Delaware, and the District of Columbia, where maybe it belongs, but that's not where it's going to hit. It's going to hit Hawaii, and it's going to come to the West Coast. And when did you catch wind of that?
Yeah, by the way, I have to say thank you for having me. I kind of jumped the gun there. I'm really happy to be on your show.
We're delighted with your work and you. It's an honor to have you.
You know, what I discovered, well, scientists discovered that this cesium that's in the ocean was not spreading out. You know, the theory had been that the cesium would dilute pretty much uniformly, almost as if you dropped, you know, some dye into a bottle. Over time, it would completely be uniform. And that's not happening. It seems to be sticking in the ocean currents. And so we're seeing high levels of cesium in the ocean currents. And then, you know, laterally to the currents, we're not seeing cesium at all. I think that's a big surprise. We had thought that the cesium would spread out over the whole Pacific. That doesn't seem to happen. So I think, you know, when the debris field and the cesium that's carried in the ocean hits, it won't be as diluted as scientists had expected it would be.
That's fearful, and it's an interesting segue. One of the things that Dan has brought for us this evening, it's not nuclear waste, but Dan, what would you classify this as?
Well, this is, as we know, about 14 billion pounds of trash finds its way into the world ocean every year. And in each ocean, or each portion of the ocean, Pacific, for example, you have the Pacific High or the Pacific Gyra, where we have a plastic soup that results from these the materials. And you notice, I don't know if you can get a close look at this, but you have very small particles. This is actually a sample from the Pacific Gyra. These are very small sample portions of plastic that photodegrade, not biodegrade. They break down into very small parts because of the wind and the salt air and the sun out in the ocean environment. Now, I know that this debris field is going to take 1 to 3 years, depending on the weight, to reach the U.S. So the question is, are we going to see a similar degradation? Some of these materials have been in the Gyra for many, many years. What are we going to see as a result of this field? And if there is radioactive contamination in that field, is that going to also disperse and bioaccumulate, as you were indicating?
Yeah, I don't know if you've been following that, the gyres that are all over the globe at this point, Arnie, but it's kind of like the Dead Seas. You know, we have 500 of those accumulate around the planet now. Isn't that right, Dan? Or that equivalent of the Gulf, but replicated all over the planet right now. And what would be, so as you were talking about earlier, and I want you to maybe explain, how does the cesium get up into the atmosphere? How does it get out, and how far does it travel before it falls in the ocean? What is that path, and what is the impact of that call? Is there something for that process?
Well, there's a couple of hundred isotopes that are released in a nuclear accident. Some are relatively short half-life, like iodine has an 8-day half-life, so in 80 days it's got 10 half-lives. We talk about cesium as if it's the only thing, But in fact, there's several kinds of cesium, 134, 137, and there's also strontium and other isotopes as well. But what happens is, if you remember back in that clip you started the show with, they are in that gap between that little tiny pellet and the rod that fits over it, gases build up. And when that rod shatters or when it becomes brittle, almost immediately all of the radioactive gases are released. Those are things like xenon and krypton. They're noble gases and they don't react. 100% of those gases were released and over the first couple days of the accident. And then what you're left with is the cesium and other isotopes. Now what happens with the cesium is that theory was, and TEPCO is still not admitting the severity of the problem with cesium in my mind. The cesium goes into the suppression pool at the bottom of the reactor, but that only holds the cesium and traps the cesium as long as it's below boiling. But we know at Fukushima the water boiled for days. So all of that cesium that was in that suppression pool can get revolatilized, and the containment was cracked, so it went out, it went airborne. Not just in the explosions, not just in the Unit 1 and Unit 3 explosions, but over a period of weeks, those containments were leaking and the cesium was not being trapped in the suppression pool, a thing called a decontamination factor, DF. The Japanese are assuming 99% of the cesium was left behind and only 1% got released. But in reality, what's happened is, as long as that water was boiling, which was for the first couple days after that accident, all of that cesium was volatile. So it goes up and stays probably in the first 7 kilometers, 5 miles of the Earth's atmosphere. It traveled inland, we all know that. And about now, the numbers today show that 10% of Japan is contaminated. And it's important to remember that the wind largely was blowing out to sea. This accident would have been much worse if the wind had been blowing toward the land as opposed to being an off-sea breeze. So a lot of it now is in the ocean, and an enormous amount is in the mountains. What we're seeing now is the cesium is showing up in places where the plume didn't reach because it's running down the rivers from the mountains and showing up in bays that in fact had never seen the airborne cesium to begin with. So it's still spreading. It hasn't stopped yet.
Well, has the meltdown itself actually stopped? Because I think most people are under the impression, like, with the Gulf, BP said, oh, it's cleanup, it's time to clean up now, and everybody's like, oh, great, it's business as usual. But we all know that isn't the case, and just recently when the storms went through, all the big tar balls were washing up out of the sand that they had tried to bury it in, and that hasn't ended at all. So what is the current status with the reactors as you understand it?
Yeah, when you turn a nuclear reactor off, you don't turn it off. The control rods drop in, and in 2 or 3 seconds, 95% of the power disappears, but then you still have 5%. And I've explained that as this is a uranium atom. 95% of the heat is liberated when they split, but 5% remains in these fission products. Now we're less than 1%, and actually we're less than 0.1%. But that's still thousands and thousands of horsepower of heat is in this molten blob at the bottom of the reactor. The reactor has failed. We're sure of that. And the molten blob has drizzled out almost like a soft ice cream onto the floor of the containment. Now, I think it's spread out pretty uniformly on the floor, and there's a large amount of water above it. So I don't think the nuclear core has melted down through the concrete. I hope not. There is a gentleman in Japan who's been saying that he expects violent explosions and things like that as this core hits the water table. I don't think that's happening because it drizzled out like an ice cream and then spread out like a pancake on the bottom. There's plenty of surface area to cool it. But it's still, as you said, it's still creating heat. Those units are still steaming. So what the Japanese are doing is they put a tent around Unit 1, not to hide the steam, but to capture the steam and send it up the stack. And over the next 6 months, they're going to put a tent around Unit 3 and Unit 4 as well. Again, they're going to try to capture it and send it up the stack where it has a better dispersal, gets to spread out, and it isn't so local. I hope I answered that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to ask you before we get too far along in this, and our audience, I think our viewers are the type of people that totally appreciate and understand what it's taking for you to get this kind of information out, and that you're an expert witness. You're not necessarily advocating for any specific position around nuclear energy, but tell us really briefly your credentials, Arnie, and why is what you have to say about nuclear power relevant and substantial?
Well, I have a bachelor's and master's in nuclear from Rensselaer. I was first in my class and first in the nuclear department, 20th out of the whole school. And I had an Atomic Energy Commission scholarship. I got my reactor operator's license on the research reactor there. Then I worked my way up from a cub engineer all the way up to a senior vice president in the nuclear industry for a licensee. I was on the radiation safety committees. I became a nuclear whistleblower in 1990, and the NRC botched the inspection and was taking bribes from my employer. That finally got identified in congressional hearings with John Glenn in 1993. And the chairman of the NRC at the time said, Mr. Gundersen's done quite a service for the United States of America. It felt good, but it's still, I was still labeled in the industry as a whistleblower. And then
that's a bad thing, right? It's bad to tell the truth.
I had a very famous attorney tell us, Arnie, in this business, you're either for us or against us, and you just crossed the line. And that's how it's been since then. And I've continued to do expert reports 3 Mile Island and St. Lucie and Indian Point and the AP1000 reactor. And I've also been the one who identified the tritium leaks here in Vermont. So it's been a 39-year odyssey.
I've got to say one of your favorite quotes, and I know Dan has a question for you, but one of the favorite things I read from you was sandbags and nuclear power plants don't belong in the same sentence.
Absolutely. And actually, that's probably a very good segue. But Arnie, my question for you is sort of following up on what I was asking about before when it comes to dispersal of this contamination, what there may be of it. You indicated some is going into the atmosphere and a piece of this is going into the ocean and parts are going into the debris field and the rest is spreading out over land. How do you see this traveling, say, east across the Pacific in terms of the traces of contamination, and what do you see happening with it?
Yeah, I think most of the airborne releases are gone now. Now, there still could be a hydrogen explosion, and that would, of course, revolatilize everything again. But barring that, or my biggest fear remains Fukushima Unit 4, which in a severe earthquake could still collapse, and the fuel pool is very precarious. So barring an earthquake that knocked over Fukushima 4 or a hydrogen explosion, I think most of the airborne releases are over to a large degree. They're still going to be releasing cesium, but not anywhere near as much as in March or April. So we're at a point with the airborne releases where we can't run and we can't hide, and it's pretty much uniformly distributed. It did fall more heavily on the Cascades in your neck of the woods. It seems like as the moist air moved across the Pacific, it hit the Rockies and dumped on the Cascades. We have data from Portland and in the Oregon area that shows around 80 becquerels per kilogram in the soil. So it's there, but it's not as significant, I believe, as what's happening in your ocean. It's slower though. You know, the ocean currents move a lot slower than the air currents. So I think we've got a slug of cesium and other things that are being picked up by the benthic organisms and working their way up the food chain into the top of the food chain animals like tuna and salmon. I love salmon, and I'm eating as much as I can this year because I'm a little bit concerned, 2 or 3 years out, that we'll start to see increasing cesium levels in it.
Yeah, that's just a frightening prospect, and I think it's one of those things. David Bloom and Jay Nichols were on the last program, our viewers would recall, and one of the things we were talking about is what is happening to our food security here, because you take out, let's say the Gulf provides what, maybe a tenth or a third of our seafood?
It's about a third of our seafood. It's one of the most productive areas around the United States, and certainly competitive in the rest of the world in terms of different seafoods, absolutely.
And then you multiply that impact, and in that China Sea, in the Sea of Japan and stuff, you've got some pretty tight competition for food resources there.
Yeah, you have a lot, yes.
I wonder what the implications are for those nations and peoples that are dependent on that immediate sea life area. And Arnie, do you have any data that would talk about when it would be before we'd see, wow, don't eat that seafood because people are actually coming down with something because of that, or the seafoods, how long would the sea life live? I wonder if we would even know that.
Well, there was a paper out about a week or two ago that discussed the fact that the cesium concentrations in rivers hundreds of miles away are increasing, not at the top end of the river, but as the river goes down, it seems to be accumulating it more and more and more, and they're seeing it in the soil. So I don't think we're at the end of the issue of contaminating Sea of Japan or the Pacific from the runoff from land. I think, I've seen some small fish, data in small fish where the cesium levels were clearly much too high for consumption. But that still hasn't worked its way up the food chain yet to the type of fish that you and I eat, the tunas and the salmons and the mackerel, the top predators. The other piece of this is we're focusing on cesium. Cesium is a muscle absorber. It's absorbed in your muscles like potassium. But strontium is a bone absorber. So we're going to be seeing, in addition to the cesium in the fish muscle, which most of us eat, is strontium in the bone. Now, in America, not many people eat the bone, but there are some fish that are eaten whole, and there's also fish stews that cook with the bone as well, and that will reliberate the strontium. So in the next several years, I'm concerned. Frankly, I think the EPA and it's just stopped monitoring what's coming in from Japan, and I think sooner or later we're going to get a tuna being pulled through off a ship and firing off a radiation detector or something like that. I don't really think that on the West Coast the government's doing a very good job of monitoring this.
Arnie, I want to confirm something you just said. I wrote a column in my Sentinel column back in August about a Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution study that's funded by the Moore Foundation, and they've had some cooperation from the Japanese government and from TEPCO, the power company. And in their announcement of the study, they basically indicate the same thesis that you have, and I'll read here from this, that the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution announcement of the study says that while elevated levels of radiation in ocean waters could present little direct impact for human exposure, long-lived isotopes can accumulate in the ocean food web, as you indicated, and bioaccumulate, and, quote, emit a persistent low dose, unquote, in the marine environment. A persistent low dose, but over time, this could pose a threat within the marine food web as things bioaccumulate as they move up. So that is entirely possible. Not to be alarmist about this, but I have not seen any of the data that Woods Hole. They began this study soon after the accident, or the tsunami. The accident occurred back in March, and I'll be very curious to see what these results are. They've been doing transects off the coast of Japan for quite a while now.
I thought
I think you're right about the low dose issue for those people on our side of the Pacific, Australia, and quite likely Hawaii. I think, and so that becomes a public health issue, where a little bit of exposure spread out over millions of people has a carcinogenic effect. But it's hard to say who got that cancer from the
Exactly.
cesium from Fukushima. But on the other coast, within 200 miles of Fukushima, up or down the coast, I'd suggest not to eat anything, not because of a low dose, but because of the likelihood of a significant dose from a fish.
Yeah, I was just talking to a good friend today, and they mentioned that their daughter had been selected to do a sister city swap in the coming year, and that she was going to be going to Tokyo as part of this sister city swap. And I said, wow, are you going to allow her to do that? When does travel and tourism and stuff like that look really ill-advised to you? I mean, with regard to Japan, would you send your kid?
We have questions like that on the website, and frankly, there's so many personal issues that play into it that I really don't give advice about. Should I move? Or I've had people call and say, should I get pregnant? It's like I really try not to answer that.
Totally respect that. Okay.
So many personal variables involved. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Another issue, of course, is just the issue of information. And one of the things that stunned me back when Deepwater Horizon first erupted and that catastrophe was going on is that BP could declare a no-fly zone in the Gulf. A corporation could declare a no-fly zone. And now with Fukushima, what kind of challenge is it for you to get information from the source? Because it seemed like for the first couple of months, there was nothing coming out of there about what was really going on.
Well, that's a great question. The releases from BP. I mean, originally they were talking about 1,000 barrels a day, and then it went up. That's called the source term. If it was a nuclear plant, it's the source term. And I saw it at 3 Mile Island, where the nuclear industry and the NRC deliberately downplayed the source term. It happened with the BP well. There were people who were saying, this is really leaking worse than you're hearing. And so the source term on BP. And when Fukushima came out, I really vowed I was not going to let that happen. And I was on CNN the very first week saying, this is as bad as Chernobyl. And and at the same time, Secretary Chu was saying, American Secretary of Energy, Chu was saying, no, it's as bad as 3 Mile Island. That, the TEPCO and the Japanese suppressed that information for 5 weeks. And unfortunately, what they had to do was, women that should have been, pregnant women that should have been evacuated, or young children that should have been evacuated, didn't, if they relied on the Japanese government. I think, though, the difference between the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima is that we have the internet now. And we've had close to 7 million visitors on our website, plus people that download it to YouTube. So that there's other ways for the information to get out. And people are reacting and moving because of what they're hearing from experts like me, as opposed to relying on Tokyo Electric.
Yeah, I'm always puzzled by what it takes for the public to say, hey, we want to know. You know, I know most of us are so busy and caught up, and we've got our own things going on, but good grief, I mean, these things impact everybody. And if we don't collectively express our right to know about them, you know, the fault's bad on us if we're not asking for the answers. But we're asking. I know a lot of people have been asking for answers on this, and where do you even go? You know, I had Dan Hirsch. I had the good fortune of having Dan Hirsch from UCSC on in April, and he, at the end of the program, I said to him, okay, Dan, so what's the next step? What's the positive action to take away from this talk tonight? And Dan said, there is none. Everybody's being paid by NRC. There isn't a politician that will stand up really against NRC. And golly, as we, the residents and the people that are going to be affected by this stuff for generations, it seems like we would have the auspices and the authority to say, keep us informed. We should at least be informed.
You know, when I was on March 11th, the day of the accident, 11 o'clock in the morning, I was talking to Maggie and I said, I can't do business today. I got to watch this accident. I said, they are going to have a meltdown. And the reason was that there was an emergency call out on the internet for batteries. And when I heard that they were running out of batteries, I knew they were toast. And yet here's the chairman of the NRC was saying for weeks that, well, we really don't know yet. We need to evaluate it more. But the data within the first 6, 7, 8 hours of the accident told me that there was a meltdown in progress and significant fuel damage in 3 different reactors. So people know this, but very few people share this. And I think, again, and I said it on our website, the difference this time is that we can all talk on the internet and we don't have to rely on those official channels.
Yeah, that's still, for now, the internet's open for us. I'm with a quandary where time is ticking by here. There's 2 clips I'd really like to show, Arnie, and one of them is the data gathering process, because I think that's pretty unique. Yep. And the other is your latest clip with the hydrogen explosion. And I don't know which you feel is more relevant or more exciting to our talk here tonight. But with Dan, with the Sea Odyssey group, I kind of feel like it's the data collection. But
it definitely is the data collection one. That one is scientifically much more important.
Yeah.
And the other one's on the website. So people want to go up on the Fairwinds website, they can get up right now. And
we do have that URL for viewers to see. Fairwinds, is that correct, with an E?
Yes, Fairwinds with an E, fairwinds.com.
Okay, so if people want to get the updated information that you have to get out to them, this way of sharing information, they can log on to your website and get that information from you.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, I just want to say from my perspective, writing about this, and we were actually at the receiving end of the tsunami. We operated out of the Santa Cruz Harbor, and 10 hours, 500 miles an hour later, we received the tsunami in the Santa Cruz Harbor, and on the west coast, several other harbors suffered great damage. So, but this is nothing compared to what is happening in Japan. So I want to thank you again for bringing us this information.
Hi, I'm Arnie Gundersen from Fairwinds. Little change of venue today. There's been some reports in the press about a hydrogen buildup inside the containment at Fukushima, and along with that hydrogen gas, there's a discussion that there's some radioactive isotopes that are in the containment that could only be caused by a fission. Well, I thought I'd simulate today what a hydrogen buildup inside a containment looks like. Now, we're going to use this bottle as a containment, and I'm going to generate hydrogen gas in this little flask. Those nails are coated with zinc, and I'll add some acid to the zinc, and we'll create hydrogen gas out this hose. Put the hose in the bottom of the bottle, and hydrogen, being lighter than air, is going to push all of the gas out of this bottle. We'll be left with a bottle full of hydrogen. All right, let's see what happens. This is something you shouldn't try at home. I'm wearing gloves, and we've got a fire extinguisher in the corner as well as bountiful water, just in case. Again, don't try this at home. All right, here's our beaker, and this is muriatic acid. And those bubbles are hydrogen gas bubbles. That are filling this containment, this bottle, with hydrogen. Now we're going to wait a little while here for this bottle to completely full. Again, hydrogen's lighter than air, so it's going to float to the top, and then it's going to gradually push all of the air out of this container. Now we've waited about 4 or 5 minutes, and this bottle should be filled with hydrogen gas. All those bubbles ran out that hose and filled this bottle with hydrogen gas. All right, I'm going to take the hose out and set the acid aside, because the next part of this lab is inside the bottle. All right, now hydrogen gas is lighter than air. So we put it in the bottom, but there's no place for it to go at the top, so it's going to stay in there. It's not going to leak out. Well, now I've put a little hole in the top of this bottle, and I'm going to light it with a match. Now what's going to happen is you're going to be seeing a little tiny flame up here. And that's the hydrogen gas escaping. It's barely visible, and I'll try to enhance it in a minute. Now there's a little flame at the top of this. It's made of hydrogen gas, pure hydrogen gas. You can see I just lit this. You notice the bottle is not burning. It's just the very tippy top of this. That's hydrogen mixing with the oxygen in air, forming that flame at the very top of this bottle. Now,
the situation is not stable at all.
Awesome.
Pretty incredible demonstration there.
Well, that's a
what
hydrogen
happened at
deflagration.
And,
That's the smaller of the two shock
even
waves.
bigger.
That's
That
what
was
happened
a
inside
deflagration.
Unit 1.
The shock wave in that soda bottle only traveled at the speed of sound. Fukushima 3 was a different kind of explosion. And was a detonation. There was much more force in the explosion of Fukushima 3 than at Fukushima 1. But I wanted to show that because there's still a hydrogen buildup in these three containments. And the only reason they're preventing another explosion is because they keep pumping lots of nitrogen in.
The visual that you had sent us, Arnie, you know, the arrow with the rubber on rack and that sort of stuff?
Yes. Yeah. Now that's from the Unit 4 fuel pool. And it was taken at the worst of the conditions in Unit 4, when they just started to pump water into the pool. And I believe it shows that the very top of the racks were exposed to air. If you look at that whole clip, it's a TEPCO clip, you'll see the steam is coming up from what appears to be below the top of the racks. And I think that was the cause of the explosion in Unit 4. was the condition of the pool. We'll find out more about that in the next year or so when they can get in the pool and actually take a look. But I made fuel racks for a living, and to me it looks like they were exposed to air, and air does not cool a nuclear fuel rack very well.
Yeah, how's seawater work for that?
Seawater's worse. I'm sure Matt knows what seawater does.
Especially bad for the seawater.
Yeah. I wondered, the thing that was amazing to me is here you've got, when they started flooding the reactor with the seawater, and then the containment kind of device that they came up with were those straw erosion control barriers that you see on Caltrans using on the side of the hill to stop dirt from sliding down the hill. What was that actually something to do, or was that just somebody's idea that we have to make it look like we're doing something?
Well, the saltwater issue, it was the last. No one, every engineer knows you don't put salt against stainless steel, especially if the stainless steel is at 1,000 degrees or 500 degrees or something like that. It's very dangerous. But they knew they had to because they had no other choice. And in the chain of command, the plant manager at Fukushima wanted to do it. He asked his superiors, and they said, no, don't do it. And he overrode his own superiors. And the plant manager, to my mind, is a hero because he overrode his superiors. He had to get water in, or they would have had to evacuate the whole site. So if there's anyone who bucked the trend, it's the plant manager at Fukushima for basically telling the senior management that he wasn't going to do what they asked him to do. And he was down to his last card, and he pumped the salt water in. A really brave man.
Wow. I want to come back. We didn't see the clip on data collection, but I want Dan to explain a little bit about what you guys do on the Sea Odyssey with the kids, and then I want you, Arnie, to explain what you've done with the data collection for Fukushima here.
Okay. Well, what I want to do is direct you to a couple of the pictures that we have up here of our program, and data collection is part of what we do. It's actually for educational purposes. We don't collect data for a marine laboratory. O'Neill Sea Odyssey is a youth science program. We serve around 200 schools a year, and we serve mostly low-income youth. It's a free program, and one of the core of our program is plankton, which is, of course, the phytoplankton is the core of the marine food web. So when we are out on the boat, we stop at 3 places, and we have 3 groups of kids. And I have another photo here of some work we do with navigation. So what we do is at each point, we note where that point in the ocean was, and then we also collect plankton at that point with a plankton net. And each of these 3 groups will come back to our education center, which is at the Santa Cruz Harbor, and we'll look at the plankton, the density of the plankton, the types of plankton. And of course, this way the kids learn in a hands-on way about how things work in the marine food web, with this being the base, how bioaccumulation works. In other words, if there are toxins, how they accumulate moving up the marine food web. It's a great science lesson. But I think here, the kids are also learning the scientific methods. So things like collecting data as a result of the Fukushima accident, for example, makes a lot more sense to them. And of course, they're doing it in an outdoor environment. The most important aspect of this is the ocean is the major feature on the planet Earth. It's integrated with our atmosphere. It's integrated with land, of course, in many, many ways. But the ocean is the largest feature. We know relatively little about it. We do have to protect it. So to engender the next generation of stewards, we have to teach kids about the ocean, how it operates. So our program is the core of doing that. We begin with that, and then the schools that use our program will use curriculum based on our program to integrate the ocean into the science lessons that the kids have. It's the world's largest science classroom. It's the world's largest science laboratory. And the ocean is vast. It's a major economic feature on our planet too. It's how things move back and forth. We get a lot of seafood out of it, as we were discussing before. It produces half of the world's oxygen. It comes from phytoplankton in the ocean. So we do have to take care of it. And when little things like this happen, there is an impact. So the way we start is through teaching the kids about how the ocean operates and how we as individuals have an impact on it.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic program, and I hope we get you out here to Santa Cruz at some point, Arnie, and you and Maggie can come out and take a look at the lab. We have a caller on the line, and I would like to get a question in from our caller, so bear with us for a moment, Arnie, and let's see how we can relay that. Hello, caller, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Do you have a question or a comment?
I actually have 2 questions.
Oh, fire away.
I have one for Dan, which is, I wish I could go. Your program sounds absolutely phenomenal. I wonder the age bracket of children you take out, but really important for me is there anything like your program anywhere on the East Coast? I have a nephew who I would just love to get out there, or do I have to fly him to California? And then I have a question for Arnie, which is, I live in the high desert. I don't live by Santa Cruz. I don't live on the coast. I don't eat fish. I am very concerned about Fukushima, of course. We all should be. But do you have any worries about airborne in the United States, in Canada, in other countries, contamination? And B, I thought that cesium really wasn't too troublesome, but I guess I'm wrong on that. And I thought it went away very quickly, dissipated. And I'm thinking maybe I'm wrong on that. And besides fish, is there much concern? I know you said that in Japan they're finding higher levels in the rivers, where the rivers are running. But what about in our country or in other countries? Is much of this a concern from airborne contamination? And I'll listen on the internet.
Thank you so much Thank you so much for the call. So we have a little bit of time here left, Arnie. We have 2 questions. Dan?
For the age bracket is 4th through 6th grade, and depending on what part of the East Coast you're on, there are similar programs to ours.
So how would you find those?
Well, best thing that you can do is email me. Just go on o'neillseaodyssey.org, go to the contact section about the program and find my email, and I'll help you locate those.
Oh, awesome. Great. Arnie, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great. And did you hear the question? How do we track the spread of this? And if you don't eat seafood, how are you liable to be impacted by it?
Well, I don't know where that listener was from, but I think she said the East Coast. And
no,
I don't believe there's a problem with East Coast fishing. We've seen particles of radiation in people's gardens. Marco Kaltofen, the guy who does all the analysis for us, actually dug up his garden and found cesium clearly from Fukushima, and he lives in Boston. But it's low level and it's spread out up and down the coast. And I guess we're all in this together. We can't run and we can't hide. That doesn't hold the Cascades. I think if you're on the West Coast in the Cascades, you need to demand more of your, Oregon and Washington State and California, of your local officials or of the federal government to look into what's in the fish. Not just the saltwater fish from the salt that's coming over through the ocean, but also what's rained out on the land and is now, in the local river. So I guess I had 2 answers.
It isn't just the fish. One of the first reports we saw back in late April was from UC Davis scientists, and they were talking about picking up radiation particulate levels in the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And that's the drinking water reservoir for San Francisco. So to say that our drinking water is exposed to radiation levels that were unsafe, and then they said, well, you know what? In disasters, we're going to have a little higher level of unsafe. So the EPA's answer was, let's move the number up so it doesn't look so bad. But I mean, holy crow, is that the best we can do to protect ourselves?
No, it's not. You know, we also saw the hot particles in Seattle back in April, and you know, finally I've been exonerated because we took a lot of flack on that. But you know, Marco Kaltofen's paper to the American Public Health Association actually talks about his monitoring equipment in Seattle did pick up the hot particles. So it was a wave of significant radiation hit the West Coast and sort of settled in on the Cascades.
We are down to like 3 minutes, and I just wanted to share this with our viewers. We promised we would hand out our special Thanksgiving Turkey Award. This goes every year to our eco-disaster people, and I think it's fair to say TEPCO has stepped right up to claim this trophy piece, and I'd be happy to hand deliver to any company representative that wants to come over somewhere where the radiation isn't probably so bad. So it's a good opportunity for them to get away. I want to ask if there's any quick parting thought that you have, and thank you so much. You and Maggie and Fair Winds Associates are just awesome. I really respect your work, and thank you so much for being on.
Well, thanks. Parting thoughts is, well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks for all the people that have watched the Fairwind site. I really, that's been heartening. We don't take any salaries out of this, but it's been heartening to get the emails, so thank you. Parting thought is we need to be vigilant, and I would not trust the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to take that role away from us.
Excellent. Dan, how about you?
Well, I just want to say that, and I just want to do a quick advertisement. We have the preliminary results of a long-term study of our programs. We're looking at kids in high school who've been through our program in elementary school, finding that they are retaining a sophisticated understanding of how individual behavior impacts the ocean as well as societal behavior impacts the ocean. And we've been talking about both those things today. So I think, again, it's important to us that we stay on top of these crises and these issues, but also to educate the kids so that we have stewardship in the future so we don't have these kinds of problems. Boy,
that's so important. Dan Hafley from O'Neill Sea Odyssey, Arnie and Maggie Gundersen with Fair Winds Associates, heroes to me, and you know, continue your good work. We need those voices in the darkness. And tell your friends. You can watch this Tuesday, Thursday night, 6 and 10 p.m. You can see it on the internet. This is important. Please pass it on. Don't let this info die. And we'll catch you on our next live show.
I got a tiny piece of ground and I call it my own. Call it my own, call it my own. I got a tiny piece of ground and I call it my own. It's a home for a big old redwood tree. You know the loggers may not like it, but I call it my own. Call it my